The teacup shattered against the floor of Bramfield House, and every head in the drawing room turned toward Catherine Harrington. "You will not embarrass this family again," her Aunt Delia hissed, rising from her chair like a judge delivering a sentence. "No nobleman in England would ever want you, not with your father's debts, not with your name dragged through every parlour in London." Catherine knelt to gather the broken porcelain, her hand steady, even as her chest burned. Her cousin Rowena said nothing from the settee, only smiled into her needlework, and that silence cut deeper than any words could. "Get up," Delia snapped. "Fix your hair. The Ashworth ball is tonight, and you will not shame me by looking like a beggar." Catherine rose, chin lifted, refusing to let them see her hands tremble. She had no notion that before the night ended, a carriage bearing a ducal crest would stop outside Ashworth House, that a man named Charles Harrington would step down into the candlelight, and that his eyes would find her before anyone else's in that glittering room. What happens when the Duke finally sees her? Like this video, if you're hooked already, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of Catherine's story. I'll be reading every comment and replying, so let me know what you think happens next. The ballroom of Ashworth House blazed with candlelight, hundreds of flames trembling in crystal chandeliers overhead, their glow spilling across polished floors and gilded mirrors that stretched the light into infinity. Catherine Harrington stood near a marble column at the edge of the room, watching couples turn and glide through the steps of a quadrille, their gowns catching the light in layered waves of embroidered silk and delicate lace. She had not wanted to come, but Aunt Delia had made it clear that refusal was not permitted. "Smile," Delia murmured beside her, her voice pitched low enough that only Catherine could hear it, yet sharp enough to cut. "You are a guest in this house because I allow it. Do not forget yourself." Catherine said nothing. She had learned, over the past year, that silence was safer than argument. Her father's debts had swallowed everything, the townhouse, the carriage, even the modest jewelry her mother had left her, and what remained was this arrangement, living under her aunt's roof, tolerated rather than welcomed, useful only as a warning to other young women of what ruin looked like. Across the room, her cousin Rowena laughed at something a gentleman had said, tossing her head so that the candlelight caught in her hair. Rowena had never known want. She had never stood in a drawing room and watched her own inheritance dissolve into nothing. She had certainly never been told, in front of witnesses, that no nobleman in England would ever want her. "There she is," a voice whispered nearby, not bothering to lower itself enough. The Harrington girl. Her father lost everything at cards, you know, every last shilling. "And her mother's family cut her off completely," another voice answered. "No dowry, no prospects. A pity, really. She was handsome enough once." Catherine's face burned, but she kept her chin level and her eyes forward, the way her mother had taught her long before illness had taken her. Never let them see it land. She had repeated that to herself so many times it had become something like armor, thin but serviceable. A young woman broke away from a nearby cluster of guests and crossed toward her, moving quickly, her skirts rustling. This was Florence, the vicar's daughter, one of the few people in that glittering room who had never once looked at Catherine as though she were something to be pitied or avoided. "Ignore them," Florence said, taking Catherine's arm. "They have nothing else to talk about. Half of them are drowning in debts of their own, only no one dares whisper it because their fathers still hold titles." "It is difficult to ignore an entire room," Catherine admitted quietly. "Then look at something else." Florence tilted her head toward the tall windows, where the gardens beyond glowed faintly under a rising moon. Jasper says there is a fountain out there, modelled after one in Florence. He has been trying to get me to walk with him all evening, but I told him I would not abandon you to the wolves. Despite herself, Catherine felt the corner of her mouth lift. Jasper was Florence's brother, awkward and earnest, forever tripping over his own good intentions, and utterly devoted to his sister in a way that Catherine sometimes envied more than she would admit. Before she could answer, a stir moved through the room, beginning near the entrance and rippling outward like wind across a field of wheat. Conversations faltered, heads turned, even the musicians seemed to falter for half a beat before recovering their rhythm. "What is it?" Florence asked, rising onto her toes to see over the crowd. Catherine turned as well, and for a moment she could see nothing but the shifting mass of guests, silk and velvet, and the glint of jewelry catching candlelight. Then the crowd parted, the way water parts around a stone, and she saw him. He was tall, dressed with a plainness that somehow made every other gentleman in the room look overdressed by comparison, his dark coat unadorned by the excessive trimmings so many favoured. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to prove he belonged anywhere. Beside her, she heard someone breathe out the name like a prayer. The Duke of Winterfell. Catherine had heard the name before, in scraps of gossip exchanged over tea, in the awed murmurs of women twice her age. Charles Harrington. The name struck her strangely, an echo of her own, though she knew of no connection between his family and hers. He had inherited the title young, after his father's sudden death, and had spent the years since largely absent from London society, managing his estates in the north rather than parading through ballrooms. His arrival tonight was, by every account she could gather from the whispers around her, entirely unexpected. "He never comes to these things," Florence said under her breath, staring. "Jasper will be insufferable. He has wanted an introduction to that man for years." Their host, old Lord Ashworth, hurried forward to greet the Duke personally, bowing with a stiffness that betrayed his age and his eagerness both. Delia appeared as if summoned from nowhere, positioning herself and Rowena directly in the Duke's path, her smile bright and calculated. Catherine watched from a distance as the introductions unfolded, as Rowena curtsied with practiced grace, as Delia spoke in the honeyed tones she reserved for anyone with wealth or standing. The Duke inclined his head politely to each of them, but his expression remained unreadable, courteous without warmth, the look of a man performing an obligation rather than enjoying an evening. "Come," Florence said, tugging at Catherine's sleeve. "Let us go to the gardens before Jasper embarrasses himself trying to force an introduction." But Catherine did not move. Something held her in place, some instinct she could not name. And in that stillness, across the crowded room, the Duke's gaze lifted from Rowena's animated chatter and found her. It was only a moment, a single breath, perhaps two, but she felt it as though the room itself had gone quiet around them, as though every candle had burned brighter for that one instant. His expression shifted, some flicker she could not quite read, curiosity perhaps, or recognition, though she was certain they had never met. Then Delia's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "And this," she said, turning slightly, her tone shifting to something colder, "is my niece, Catherine. You must forgive her, Your Grace. She rarely attends these functions. Family circumstances, you understand." The words were meant to wound, and Catherine felt them land exactly as intended, a dozen curious eyes turning toward her, waiting to see how deeply the humiliation would cut. But the Duke did not look away from her, not even as Delia spoke. He crossed the remaining distance between them himself without waiting for further introduction, and Catherine's heart climbed into her throat. "Miss Harrington," he said, and his voice was quieter than she expected, steady in a way that seemed entirely unbothered by the dozens of eyes now fixed upon them both. "Forgive my presumption. I could not help but notice we share a name." "A coincidence, Your Grace," Catherine managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Nothing more." "Perhaps." Something in his gaze suggested he was not entirely convinced. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance?" A ripple of astonishment moved through the nearest guests, quick and unmistakable. Rowena's smile froze. Delia's mouth opened, then closed again, as though she could not decide which objection to voice first. Florence's fingers tightened on Catherine's arm, a silent, thrilled warning. Catherine looked up at him. At this man the whole room had been whispering about only moments before, and felt the weight of every cruel word Delia had ever spoken settle strangely in her chest, no longer quite so crushing. "I would be honored," she said. He offered his arm, and as she took it, she caught sight of her aunt's face over his shoulder, pale with fury and disbelief. Rowena's eyes had narrowed into something sharp and calculating, no longer amused. The musicians began a new piece, slow and formal, and the crowd drew back to make space upon the floor. Catherine felt every eye in that glittering room upon her, but for the first time, in longer than she could remember, she did not feel small beneath their gaze. She felt instead as though the ground beneath her had shifted, quietly and completely, and that nothing in her narrow, careful world would ever be quite the same again. What none of them knew, not Catherine, not Delia, not even the Duke himself as he led her onto the floor, was that this single dance would set in motion a chain of events that would upend two households, expose secrets buried for years, and force a reckoning that London society would speak of for seasons to come. The music swelled, and Catherine placed her hand in the Duke's with a steadiness that surprised even her. His grip was firm but careful, as though he understood exactly how fragile the moment felt, how many eyes were fixed upon them, cataloguing every gesture for tomorrow's gossip. "You dance as though you would rather be anywhere else," he said, as they began the first turn, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I have had little practice at pretending otherwise." "Then let us not pretend." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Tell me something true instead." Catherine glanced past his shoulder, at Delia standing rigid near the refreshment table, at Rowena's narrowed eyes following their every step. "The truth, Your Grace, is that half this room is wondering why you have chosen to humiliate yourself by dancing with me, and the other half, wondering why I haven't yet fainted from the shock of it." That earned a real laugh, low and startled, as though it had escaped before he could stop it. Several heads turned at the sound. "You are more amusing than I expected, Miss Harrington. You expected something of me at all? I was under the impression you had never heard my name, until tonight." "I had heard it," he admitted, "though not in circumstances I care to repeat in a ballroom." Something in his tone made her look up sharply, but before she could ask what he meant, the dance carried them apart, the pattern of steps separating them for a long moment before drawing them back together. When her hand met his again, his expression had settled into something more careful, more deliberate. "Your father," he said quietly, "was known to mine. Before his passing." Catherine's chest tightened. "I did not know that." "Few do. It was some years ago, business rather than friendship, though not unkindly meant." He hesitated, as though weighing how much further to go. "I confess I did not come tonight expecting to find you here." Then why did you come at all, Your Grace? I understand you rarely attend these functions. A fair question. His eyes held hers, steady and unreadable. Perhaps I will answer it once I have decided the answer myself. The music ended before she could press him further, the final notes fading into applause and the shuffle of couples separating. He bowed over her hand, his lips not quite touching her glove, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved. Thank you for the dance, Miss Harrington. Thank you for the kindness, Your Grace, whatever your reasons for it. He held her gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, then released her hand and stepped back into the crowd, immediately swallowed by well-wishers and eager mothers steering their daughters into his path. Catherine stood alone at the edge of the floor, her heart still unsteady, until Florence appeared at her elbow and pulled her toward a quiet alcove behind a bank of potted ferns. "You are shaking," Florence whispered, delighted. "The Duke of Winterfell asked you to dance in front of the entire room, and you are shaking." "I am not shaking. You are entirely shaking." Jasper nearly wept with envy. He has wanted 5 minutes of that man's attention for 3 years, and you have had a full quadrille. Before Catherine could answer, a shadow fell across them both. Delia stood there, her face composed into the smooth, pleasant mask she wore for company, though her eyes were anything but pleasant. "A word, Catherine," she said, her voice honey over iron. "Now, if you please." Florence squeezed her hand once before stepping back, and Catherine followed her aunt into a narrow corridor just beyond the ballroom, away from curious ears, though not far enough to escape the distant strains of music. "What game are you playing?" Delia demanded the moment they were alone. "I played no game." He asked. "I could hardly refuse a duke in front of 200 witnesses. You will not encourage him further. Do you understand me? A man like that doesn't marry ruin. He dances with it once, out of some passing curiosity, and then he forgets it exists." Delia's eyes glittered, sharp and cold. "Rowena has spent the season cultivating an acquaintance with his sister. I will not have you undo months of careful work because a duke found your misfortune momentarily diverting. I sought nothing from him, aunt. I only answered when spoken to. See that it remains so." Delia straightened her gloves, composing herself. "Rowena will be introduced to him properly before the night ends. You will not interfere again." She swept away, leaving Catherine alone in the corridor with her pulse still unsteady, and her aunt's words settling like stones in her stomach. She had not asked for any of this. She had not sought the Duke's attention, had not maneuvered for it the way Rowena had spent weeks maneuvering, and yet already she was being blamed for it, already being warned off something she had never claimed to want. She made her way back toward the ballroom slowly, unwilling to return to the crush of watching eyes just yet, and found herself instead drawn toward a side door leading out to the gardens. The night air was cool against her heated face, and she walked a little way along the gravel path, past the fountain Florence had mentioned, its water catching moonlight in silver ribbons. "You have found the one quiet corner of the entire estate," a voice said behind her. "I am rather impressed." She turned to find the Duke standing a few paces away, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression far more relaxed than it had been inside among the crowds. "Your Grace, I did not realize anyone else had escaped." Escaped is precisely the word. He came to stand beside her at the edge of the fountain, careful to keep a respectable distance. "I find I have very little patience for rooms full of people all wanting something from me at once." "And what do you imagine I want from you?" "Nothing, as it happens, which is rather refreshing." He studied her for a moment in the moonlight. May I ask you something direct, Miss Harrington? You may ask. I cannot promise an answer. Your aunt made a point earlier of mentioning your family circumstances in a manner clearly meant to diminish you before the entire room. His jaw tightened slightly. Why do you tolerate it? Catherine's fingers curled at her sides. Because I have very little choice, Your Grace. My father's debts left nothing behind but obligations, and my aunt's household is the only roof willing to shelter me, however grudgingly. That is not tolerance. That is survival. Perhaps there is little difference when one has no fortune and no family left to intervene. He was quiet for a moment, watching the water ripple in the moonlight. I lost my own father rather suddenly, he said finally. 6 years ago now. I inherited a title, an estate in considerable disarray, and a great many people who expected me to fix everything at once, though I had barely finished mourning him. I understand something about being made to carry weight one didn't ask to carry. That is not the same as being told, in front of witnesses, that no nobleman would ever want you. The words left her before she could stop them, sharper and more honest than she had intended. She saw something shift in his expression, surprise, and beneath it, something closer to anger, though not directed at her. Someone said that to you? My aunt. Several times, tonight and before. Catherine straightened, embarrassed by her own candor. Forgive me. I should not have spoken so freely. Do not apologize for honesty. It is rarer than you might think, particularly in a room like the one we just left. He studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in his gaze. Your aunt is mistaken, Miss Harrington. Whatever else may be true of your circumstances, she is entirely mistaken in that. Before Catherine could respond, footsteps sounded on the gravel path behind them, quick and hurried. Florence appeared at the garden entrance, slightly out of breath. Catherine, there you are. I have been searching everywhere. Your aunt is asking for you, and I think you had better come quickly. It concerns your father. The words struck like ice water. My father is dead, Florence. What concerns could there possibly be? Florence's face was pale, uncertain. A man has arrived at the house. He says he has documents your father left behind, and that they change everything. Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her a second time that night, though this time there was no music to soften the fall. She turned back toward the Duke, uncertain what to say, but he had already straightened, his expression sharpened into something alert and watchful. Go, he said quietly. Whatever this is, face it directly. I suspect you have spent long enough letting others speak for you. She nodded, gathered her skirts, and followed Florence back, toward the house, her heart hammering with a dread she could not name, leaving the Duke standing alone beside the moonlit fountain, watching her go with an expression no one remained to witness. The drawing room at Bramfield House felt smaller than Catherine remembered, crowded now with candlelight and tension, and a stranger she had never seen before, standing near the hearth, with his hat still in his hands, as though he had not decided whether he meant to stay. Delia stood near the window, her composure cracked at the edges, and Rowena hovered by the door, curiosity plain on her face, despite her mother's attempts to wave her away. Miss Harrington. The stranger inclined his head as Catherine entered, Florence close behind her. He was an older man, grey at the temples, with the careful bearing of someone accustomed to serving households far grander than his own. Forgive the lateness of the hour. My name is Mr. Aldous Fenwright. I served your mother's family for many years before her passing. Catherine's breath caught. My mother's family cut all ties before I was born. I was told there was nothing left to speak of. That is what you were told, yes. Fenwright glanced briefly at Delia, something guarded passing between them. It is not entirely true. Delia's mouth thinned. This is hardly the hour for old history, Mr. Fenwright. Whatever business you believe you have here can surely wait until morning. I'm afraid it cannot, madam. Not after tonight. He turned back to Catherine, and from beneath his coat he produced a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age, bound with a thin strap of leather. Your mother entrusted this to me before her death, with instructions that it not be opened until you had come of age and found yourself, in her words, standing before a choice that mattered. Catherine stared at the box as though it might bite her. What choice? I do not know the whole of it. I was only asked to deliver it, and to wait until the right moment presented itself. His eyes softened slightly. I saw you tonight, Miss Harrington, dancing at Ashworth House. I believe your mother would have called that moment right enough. Florence stepped closer, curious despite herself, but Catherine's hands trembled as she took the box, its weight far heavier than its size suggested. She set it on the small table near the fire and worked the leather strap loose with fingers that did not want to obey her. Inside lay a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, tied together with faded ribbon, and beneath them a miniature portrait in a tarnished silver frame. Catherine lifted it into the candlelight and felt the room tilt beneath her. The woman in the portrait wore her mother's face, younger than Catherine had ever known her, laughing at something beyond the frame. But it was not the portrait itself that stole the breath from her lungs. It was the inscription etched into the frame's edge, faint but legible. To my dearest E, from C, forever, though the world forbids it. Aunt Delia. Catherine's voice came out unsteady. What is this? Delia's face had gone the colour of old ash. Put it away, Catherine. This is not the time. You knew. Catherine looked between her aunt and Fenwright, understanding it was dawning slowly and terribly. You knew there was more to my mother's history than a simple falling out with her family. Fenwright cleared his throat gently. Your mother, Miss Harrington, was once engaged to be married, before she ever met your father. The match was broken off, quite suddenly, by both families, and she was sent away within the month. She married your father not long after, a good man, but not the one she had chosen for herself. Engaged to whom? Catherine's voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. Fenwright hesitated, and it was Delia who finally answered, her composure cracking entirely now, years of careful silence collapsing all at once. To the late Duke of Winterfell, she said. Charles Harrington's father. The room seemed to hold its breath around her. Rowena's mouth fell open. Florence's hand found Catherine's arm, steadying her as the floor seemed to tilt. That cannot be, Catherine said, though even as she spoke, she thought of the way the current Duke had looked at her, across the ballroom, the strange familiarity in his gaze, the coincidence of shared names he had remarked upon himself. Why would you never tell me? Because it did not matter, Delia snapped, though her voice shook now. It was decades ago. Old scandal, old grief, buried long before you were born. Your mother married beneath her own family's expectations, gave up a future among the highest circles in England, and what did it earn her? Debt, disgrace, and a daughter left with nothing but her name. She drew a sharp breath. I did not tell you, because I hoped you would never have cause to know. I hoped you would never cross paths with that family at all. But I have crossed paths with them. Catherine's mind raced backward through every moment of the evening, The Duke's careful questions, his unfinished thoughts about coming tonight for reasons he had not yet decided to share. He knows something. He must. Why else would he have singled me out? Perhaps he recognized the name, Florence offered quietly. Perhaps his father spoke of her, once, and he never forgot it. Rowena, who had said nothing through all of this, finally found her voice, sharp and cold. This changes everything, Mother. If the Duke's own father once loved her mother, imagine what people will say if he takes an interest in the daughter. It will look as though history is repeating itself, as though he is completing some old unfinished romance. Her eyes gleamed with something calculating. Society adores nothing more than a story like that. It could ruin us both, or elevate her entirely, and I do not know which frightens me more. Enough, Delia said sharply, though her voice lacked its usual authority now. No one outside this room is to speak of this. Do you understand me, all of you? If this reaches London before I have decided how to manage it, we will all suffer for it. Catherine barely heard her. She was staring at the letters, still bundled in the box, dozens of them, her mother's careful handwriting, visible on the folded edges. A lifetime of correspondence, apparently, kept secret for decades, hidden away until tonight. I want to read them, she said quietly. Catherine. Delia's tone turned pleading, an unfamiliar sound from a woman who rarely pleaded for anything. Whatever is written in those letters can only cause you pain. Let it stay buried. Let the Duke's attention tonight be nothing more than a passing curiosity, and move forward with your life as it is. You have decided what is best for me my entire life, Aunt Delia, and I have let you because I believed I had no other choice. Catherine lifted the box carefully into her arms. But this belongs to me. My mother meant for me to have it, and I will not let it stay hidden simply because it frightens you. She turned and left the drawing room before anyone could stop her, Florence hurrying after, leaving Delia standing pale and silent by the window, and Rowena watching the doorway with an expression that had shifted from shock into something far more dangerous, the slow, calculating look of a woman already deciding how this new information might be turned to her advantage. Upstairs, in the privacy of her small chamber, Catherine untied the ribbon with shaking hands and began to read, and with every line her mother's voice rose up from the page, young and heartbroken and achingly familiar, describing a love story cut short by two families more concerned with position than happiness, a story that ended not in tragedy exactly, but in a quiet, lifelong ache that Catherine now understood she had inherited without ever knowing its source. And somewhere beneath the grief of it, a colder thought took hold, one she could not quite push away. If the old Duke had once loved her mother enough to write such letters, and if his son had sought her out tonight with such deliberate purpose, then perhaps nothing about their meeting had been a coincidence at all. 3 days passed before Catherine saw the Duke again. 3 days in which she read her mother's letters until the ink blurred before her eyes, and the ribbon that had bound them grew soft from handling. She learned of a courtship carried out in secret glances and stolen walks of two families who had decided, without consulting either party, that a duke's heir could not marry the daughter of a mere gentleman farmer, however genteel his blood. She learned that her mother had been sent away within a fortnight of the engagement's end, married within the year to a man she had barely known, and that the letters stopped abruptly after that, as though something in her mother had simply closed a door and never opened it again. On the 4th morning, a note arrived at Bramfield House, sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest, addressed to Catherine alone. Miss Harrington, I find I cannot stop thinking of our conversation in the garden, nor of the manner in which it was interrupted. I would be glad of the opportunity to call upon you properly, if you are willing to receive me. There are matters I believe we ought to discuss, concerning both our families. Winterfell Delia intercepted the note before Catherine could hide it, reading it over her shoulder with an expression that shifted from alarm to something more calculating. He wishes to call, Delia said slowly. Properly. That is not the behavior of a man merely curious about an old scandal. What would you have me do, Aunt? Refuse a duke? I would have you be careful. Delia handed the note back, her fingers lingering a moment too long. Rowena has spent the season building a connection to his sister, Lady Beatrix. If he begins calling on you instead, openly, publicly, it will be noticed by everyone in London within a week. There will be talk. There will be questions about why a duke has taken such sudden interest in the daughter of a ruined family, and eventually someone will uncover the connection between your mother and his father. Once that happens, we lose all control over how the story is told. Perhaps I am tired of other people controlling how my story is told. Delia's eyes narrowed, but for once she said nothing further, only turned and left the room, and Catherine understood that her aunt's silence was not surrender, but calculation, the quiet of someone rearranging a plan rather than abandoning it. The Duke arrived that afternoon, precisely on time, driving himself in a plain curricle rather than sending a grander carriage, a small detail Catherine noticed and did not entirely understand until Florence, who had come to sit with her for support, pointed out that a man of his station rarely troubled himself to drive anywhere alone. He did not want an audience of servants gossiping about his visit, Florence murmured as they watched from the window. That is either very romantic or very calculating, and I cannot decide which. He was shown into the small parlour, and Delia insisted on remaining present, seated stiffly in the corner with Rowena beside her, both watching every word exchanged with sharp, unblinking attention. Miss Harrington. He bowed, his manner formal in front of witnesses, though his eyes held hers a moment longer than strict courtesy required. Thank you for receiving me. Your Grace. Catherine gestured toward a chair. You mentioned matters concerning both our families. He glanced briefly at Delia and Rowena before answering, choosing his words with visible care. After you left the garden that night, I found myself unable to stop wondering about the coincidence of our names. I made inquiries the following morning among my father's old papers. He paused. I found a portrait among them, a young woman I did not recognize, though something about her seemed familiar. It was only when my sister mentioned overhearing the talk of a Miss Harrington whose mother had once been engaged to our father that I understood why. Rowena's fingers tightened visibly around her teacup, though she said nothing. Then you already knew, Catherine said quietly, before you asked me to dance. No, I did not know that night. I only knew your name struck me strangely, and I could not account for why. His gaze steadied on her. I have since read a great deal about the engagement that was broken off. My father never spoke of it in my hearing, not once in all my years, though I have since found letters of his own, unfinished and unsent, that suggest he never fully recovered from the loss. Catherine's breath caught. You have his letters as well? I do. And I confess, Miss Harrington, I find myself wondering whether we are meant to correct something that was broken a generation ago, or whether we are simply two strangers being pulled into a story that was never truly ours to finish. Delia rose abruptly from her corner, her composure fraying. Forgive my interruption, Your Grace, but surely you cannot mean to suggest that old history between our families should influence anything in the present. Whatever affection existed between your father and my sister has no bearing on my niece's situation now. I mean to suggest nothing beyond what I have already said, Lady Delia. His tone remained even, though something firmer had entered it. I have simply found myself drawn to your niece's company, and I intend to continue calling upon her, with her permission, regardless of what history preceded it. Rowena's composure finally cracked. And what of Lady Beatrix's friendship with me, Your Grace? I had understood there was an expectation, given how often your sister and I have corresponded this season, that our families might be drawn closer together in time. The Duke's expression turned carefully neutral. My sister values her friendships for their own sake, Miss Rowena, and I would not presume to speak for her expectations. As for my own intentions, I have made no promises to anyone that I do not intend to keep. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Rowena's face had gone pale, then flushed with something close to fury, quickly masked, but not quickly enough for Catherine to miss it entirely. The visit continued another quarter hour, stilted and formal under Delia's watchful presence. But as the Duke rose to take his leave, he asked quietly whether Catherine might walk him to his carriage, a request so ordinary that even Delia could not refuse it without appearing unreasonable. Outside, in the cool afternoon air, away from listening ears, his manner softened considerably. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not intend to create difficulty between you and your cousin." "You didn't create it, Your Grace. It was there long before you arrived." Catherine glanced back toward the house, where she could see Rowena's shadow still lingering near the parlor window. "Though I imagine you have made it considerably worse. Do you regret that I called?" "No." The word left her before she could weigh it. "Though I do not entirely understand what you want from me, Your Grace. A dance is one thing. Letters and family history are another. And now you speak of continuing to call in front of my aunt and cousin, as though you have already decided something I have not yet been asked to agree to." He studied her for a long moment, something unguarded crossing his features. "You are right to say so. I have been thinking of little else since that night, and I have perhaps moved faster than is fair to you. Forgive me." He hesitated. "What I want, Miss Harrington, is simply the chance to know you properly, without the weight of old history deciding the outcome before we have even begun. Whatever happened between our parents belongs to them. I would like whatever happens between us to belong entirely to ourselves." Catherine felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some tightly held breath she had not realized she was holding. "That is a fair request." "Then may I call again?" "You may." He smiled, a real smile this time, unguarded and warm, and took her hand briefly before climbing into his curricle. Catherine watched him drive away down the narrow lane, and it was only when she turned back toward the house that she saw Rowena standing in the doorway, her expression no longer angry, but eerily calm, the look of someone who had already begun forming a plan. "You ought to be careful, cousin," Rowena said softly as Catherine approached. "Dukes are fickle creatures, and fortune favors those clever enough to seize what others merely dream of." She turned and disappeared back into the house before Catherine could ask what precisely she meant, leaving only the cold certainty that whatever came next, Rowena did not intend to lose gracefully. The invitations began arriving within a week, each one addressed to Catherine directly, a novelty so sudden and so strange that even the servants at Bramfield House whispered about it below stairs. A dinner at Lord and Lady Marchmain's townhouse. A morning call from Lady Beatrix herself, curious and warm, and entirely without the coldness Catherine had expected from a duke's sister. A private concert, hosted by friends of the Winterfell family, where Catherine found herself seated, deliberately she suspected, beside Charles himself. "You are becoming fashionable," Florence observed one afternoon, helping Catherine dress for yet another engagement. "A month ago, no one in London would have received you. Now half the invitations in the city bear your name." "It has nothing to do with fashion," Catherine said. "It has to do with a duke's attention and everyone wishing to be near it." "Does that trouble you?" Catherine considered the question honestly. "A little. I do not know how much of this warmth is real, and how much is merely reflected light." She had reason to wonder. Delia's manner toward her had shifted these past weeks into something almost civil, though Catherine recognized calculation beneath the change rather than genuine affection. Rowena, by contrast, had grown quieter, watchful in a way that unsettled Catherine far more than open hostility ever had. She smiled at the right moments, offered congratulations at the right moments, and said almost nothing of substance at all, and Catherine had learned enough of her cousin to know that silence, in Rowena, was never simply silence. The trouble began at Lady Marchmain's dinner 3 weeks after the Duke's first visit to Bramfield House. Catherine arrived with Delia and Rowena, seated near the middle of a long table, glittering with silver and crystal, candlelight catching in the polished surfaces until the whole room seemed to shimmer. Charles sat several places away, close enough to exchange glances across the table, far enough that conversation remained impossible until after the meal, when the guests rose and mingled through the adjoining drawing room. It was there, near a tall window overlooking the darkened garden, that a woman Catherine did not recognize approached her, her smile pleasant, but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Miss Harrington, I understand congratulations may soon be in order." Catherine blinked. "I am not certain I understand you." "Come now, there is no need for modesty among friends. The whole room is speaking of little else. The Duke's sudden and rather public attention, the two of you seated together at every gathering these past weeks." The woman's smile sharpened slightly. "Some are even saying an announcement is imminent. I only wondered whether you might confirm it, so that I might be among the first to offer my felicitations." "There is nothing to confirm," Catherine said carefully. "The Duke and I are acquainted. Nothing more." The woman's expression flickered, disappointment poorly disguised as understanding, and she drifted away toward another cluster of guests, already whispering. Catherine felt a cold unease settle in her stomach. She had said nothing untrue, and yet the rumor existed regardless, spreading through the room like smoke through an open door, and she had no notion of where it had begun. She found out an hour later, quite by accident, when she overheard Rowena's voice through a half-open door leading to a small anteroom, speaking low and urgent to another young woman Catherine recognized only vaguely as one of Rowena's particular friends. "Of course it is not confirmed," Rowena was saying, "but it hardly matters whether it is true. By the time anyone thinks to question it, half of London will already believe it, and Catherine will either have to marry him to save her reputation from the disappointment, or watch him retreat entirely to avoid a scandal of expectations he never intended to meet. Either way, it works rather neatly in my favor." Catherine's blood went cold. She pushed the door open before she could stop herself, and Rowena's face drained of color at the sight of her. "You started the rumor," Catherine said, her voice shaking with a fury she had rarely allowed herself to feel. "You told that woman we were to be announced." Rowena's companion fled the room without a word, leaving the two of them alone. Rowena's expression hardened quickly, the shock replaced by something colder and more deliberate. I told her nothing that is not already assumed by half the guests in that drawing room, Rowena said. I merely helped the assumption along. Why? What could you possibly gain from ruining my reputation? Ruining you was never the point, cousin, though I confess it would not entirely displease me. Rowena's voice dropped, sharp and precise. Think it through. If Charles Harrington believes the entire ton expects an announcement, he has two choices. He either proposes, out of obligation to protect your name from scandal, or he withdraws entirely, humiliated by the presumption, and returns his attention elsewhere. To Beatrix's circle, to me. Her chin lifted. I have spent an entire season cultivating that friendship, Catherine, long before you ever caught his eye at Ashworth House. I do not intend to lose everything because a man grew curious about an old family scandal. You would destroy my reputation on the chance that it drives him toward you instead? I would do what is necessary to secure my own future, the same as you are doing, whether you admit it to yourself or not. Rowena's eyes glittered, unrepentant. Do not pretend you are entirely innocent in this, cousin. You have enjoyed every invitation, every whisper of your rising fortune these past weeks. You are no less ambitious than I am. You simply prefer to call it something gentler. Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to deny it entirely, but a small, uncomfortable truth lodged itself beneath her anger. She had enjoyed it, the warmth of sudden acceptance, the invitations, the attention. She could not claim to be entirely untouched by ambition, however unintended its awakening had been. Whatever I have felt, she said finally, I have not lied to gain it. You have. She turned and left the anteroom before Rowena could answer, her heart pounding, her thoughts a tangled mess of anger and dread. The rumor was already loose in the world, and there was no calling it back, no explaining it away without drawing further attention to precisely the situation she most wished to avoid. She found Charles near the far end of the drawing room a short while later, and something in her face must have betrayed her distress, because his own expression sobered immediately. What has happened? There is a rumor, she said quietly, drawing him aside as best she could within the crowded room, that an announcement between us is imminent. I did not start it, Your Grace, and I do not know precisely how it began, though I have my suspicions. His jaw tightened. I have heard whispers of it myself this past hour. I confess I did not know what to make of them. I would understand entirely if this puts you in an unwelcome position. I know how quickly such things can spiral beyond anyone's control, and I would not have you feel obligated by gossip you never invited. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Do you wish it were untrue? The question caught her entirely unprepared. I do not understand. The rumor itself, setting aside how it began, setting aside obligation or scandal or anyone else's expectations. Do you wish an announcement between us were an impossibility, or do some part of you find the idea less unwelcome than you are willing to admit? Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Around them the party continued, laughter and music and the clink of glasses, entirely indifferent to the question suspended between them. She thought of the weeks past, of gardens and quiet conversations, and letters written by two people who had loved each other across a divide neither had been permitted to cross. She thought of her mother's careful handwriting, the ache still visible in every line, even decades later. I do not find it unwelcome, she admitted finally, quietly, the words costing her more courage than she had expected. But I would not have it forced into existence by rumor and obligation. If anything is ever to happen between us, Your Grace, I would want it born of choice, not scandal." Something shifted in his expression, warm and resolved. "Then let us make it a matter of choice." He glanced briefly around the crowded room, lowering his voice further. "Not tonight. Not under the weight of gossip and watching eyes. But soon, Catherine. I do not intend to let old rumors decide what happens between us, whether they were born of malice or mere coincidence." Before she could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew every eye in the room. Delia had arrived, breathless and pale, pushing past guests with none of her usual composure, and behind her came a footman Catherine recognized from Bramfield House, his expression grim. "Catherine." Delia's voice cracked as she reached them, ignoring every rule of decorum in her urgency. "You must come at once. It concerns your father's old solicitor. He has sent word tonight, most unexpectedly, and it changes everything we believed we understood about your mother's fortune, and about the true reason her engagement to the old Duke was ever broken at all." The room around them seemed to hold its breath, every guest straining to hear, and Catherine felt Charles's hand find hers briefly beneath the cover of the crowd, steady and certain, as the ground shifted beneath her feet for the second time that season. The solicitor was already waiting when they arrived at Bramfield House, seated stiffly in the same drawing room where Fenright had first delivered the wooden box weeks before. He rose as Catherine entered, an older man with tired eyes and a leather satchel clutched against his chest as though it held something dangerous. "Miss Harrington, forgive the lateness of the hour, but I judged this could not wait until morning." He glanced at Delia, then at Charles, who had followed Catherine in without hesitation, despite Delia's half-hearted protest that this was a private family matter. "What I have learned concerns your mother directly, and I believe, Your Grace, it concerns your family as well." He opened the satchel and withdrew a bundle of documents, their edges worn soft with age. "Your mother's engagement to the late Duke was not broken off by his family alone, as has always been assumed. I have spent some weeks tracing old correspondence at Mr. Fenright's request, after he grew troubled by certain inconsistencies in the story he had always been told." He hesitated. "Your mother's own father, Miss Harrington, your grandfather, arranged the breach himself, in secret, and allowed the old Duke's family to bear the blame for it ever since." Catherine felt the room tilt slightly beneath her. Why would he do such a thing? "Money, Miss Harrington. Your grandfather had accumulated debts of his own, considerable ones, hidden carefully from society. He arranged a match for your mother with your father instead, a man of lesser standing but considerable fortune at the time, and accepted a substantial sum in exchange for ending the Winterfell engagement quietly." The solicitor's voice grew heavier. "Your mother never knew the true reason. She believed, as everyone did, that the Duke's family had rejected her for want of proper birth. She carried that belief and that grief for the whole of her life." Charles had gone very still beside Catherine, his expression carefully controlled, though she could see something furious kindling behind his eyes. "My father believed the same, that her family considered him unworthy, or that she herself had changed her mind. He never knew the truth was bought and sold behind them both." "There is more," the solicitor continued, glancing uneasily toward Delia now. "Your grandfather's debts were never fully settled, even after the money changed hands. What remained passed eventually to your father, Miss Harrington, and then, upon his death, the burden of it fell in part to this household." He looked at Delia directly. "I believe, Lady Delia, you have known considerably more of this history than you ever confided to your niece." Delia's face had gone the color of parchment. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Catherine watched something crumble in her aunt's composure that she had never before seen give way. "Yes," Delia said finally, quietly. "I knew. Not everything. Not at first. But enough. My sister confided fragments of it to me before she died, fragments she herself had only begun to piece together. I told no one because the truth served no purpose I could see, except to deepen old wounds that were better left closed. Or because admitting it would have meant admitting your own family's part in causing my mother's unhappiness," Catherine said, the words coming sharper than she intended, years of careful restraint finally breaking loose. "You called me a burden, Aunt Delia. You told me no nobleman would ever want me, that my circumstances made me unworthy of anything better than gratitude for the charity you offered. And all the while you knew my mother's own suffering had been engineered by our family, sold for a debt no one thought to mention. I did what I believed necessary to protect what remained of this family's standing," Delia said, though her voice had lost all its usual iron. "I was not entirely wrong to fear what the truth might cost us. You were wrong to let me believe I was unworthy of love because of debts I never created and choices I never made." Catherine's voice shook, though she did not look away. "I have spent a year believing myself fortunate simply to be tolerated. I will not spend another moment believing it." Before Delia could answer, quick footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Rowena appeared in the doorway, breathless, her earlier composure entirely stripped away. She had clearly run from wherever she had been, and her eyes went first to her mother's stricken face, then to the documents scattered across the table. "What is happening?" I heard raised voices from the stairs. "The truth," Catherine said simply. "Finally, after 20 years. Rowena's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in the solicitor, the documents, the Duke's grim expression, her mother's uncharacteristic silence. Something in her own face shifted, the sharp calculation Catherine had grown so accustomed to seeing, giving way, unexpectedly, to something more uncertain. "I did not know," Rowena said quietly, "about any of this. I knew only fragments, the same as Mother, I think. I did not know our family had caused it." "Would it have changed anything if you had known?" Catherine asked, not unkindly, though the question carried real weight. "Would you still have spread that rumour at Lady Marchmain's dinner, hoping to force a scandal that might turn the Duke's attention toward yourself instead?" Rowena flinched visibly, and beside Catherine, Charles's head turned sharply toward her cousin, understanding dawning in his expression. Rowena's throat worked for a moment before she spoke again. "I do not know," she admitted finally, and there was something almost like honesty in it, raw and unpracticed. "I have spent so long watching Mother fight for every advantage this family could scrape together, terrified of losing what little standing we had left, that I stopped asking myself whether the fighting was right. I only knew I didn't want to lose." Her eyes glistened, though she blinked hard against it. "I am not proud of what I did, cousin. I do not expect you to forgive it. But I am sorry all the same." Catherine studied her cousin for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of it, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed it. Not entirely, not enough to forget, but enough to soften something that had been clenched tight in her chest for weeks. "I do not forgive it tonight," she said honestly, "but perhaps in time I might." Charles stepped forward then, addressing Delia directly, his voice controlled, but unmistakably firm. "Lady Delia, whatever debts remain from this old arrangement, whatever obligations were passed down through your family, I intend to see them settled. Not as charity, and not to buy anyone's silence, but because it is a long past time, this particular wound stopped bleeding into the present. Delia's eyes widened. Your Grace, that is an extraordinarily generous offer, one I have no right to expect. I am not offering it for your sake, Lady Delia, if I am honest. I am offering it because Catherine has spent her whole life paying for a debt that was never hers to carry, and I find I have very little patience left for watching that continue. He turned to Catherine, his expression softening considerably. I made you a promise once, that whatever happened between us would be a matter of choice, not obligation. I intend to keep that promise. But I would ask you now, in front of everyone gathered in this room, witnesses enough that no rumor could ever distort it into something less than the truth. He took her hand, and Catherine's heart climbed into her throat as he lowered himself, unhurried and entirely certain, onto one knee before her. Catherine Harrington, I do not offer this because our parents once loved each other and were denied the chance to finish what they began. I offer it because I have come to know you these past weeks, your honesty, your courage, the quiet strength with which you have carried burdens that were never fairly yours to bear, and I find I do not wish to spend my life without you in it. Whatever anyone has ever told you about your worth, they were entirely, completely wrong. Will you marry me? Catherine felt tears rise, unbidden and unstoppable, as she looked down at him, at the solicitor watching with quiet satisfaction, at Rowena's uncertain, hopeful expression, at Delia standing pale and finally humbled near the window. Yes, she said, and her voice did not shake at all. Yes, I will marry you. He rose and drew her into an embrace entirely improper for a drawing room full of witnesses, and no one present seemed inclined to remark upon it. Florence, who had followed close behind Delia and had been standing quietly near the door through all of it, let out a small, delighted sound and clasped her hands together, already imagining, Catherine suspected, exactly how she would describe this moment to Jasper. The wedding took place 2 months later at Winterfell Manor, beneath high windows that let golden autumn light spill across the chapel floor, surrounded by a guest list that included, to everyone's quiet astonishment, both Delia and Rowena, seated near the front rather than banished to the margins. The debts that had shadowed Catherine's family for 2 generations had been quietly settled. The old wounds between the Harrington and Winterfell families finally allowed to close, and Fenright himself stood near the back of the chapel, watching with the satisfied expression of a man who had waited 20 years to see a promise finally kept. As Catherine walked the length of the aisle toward Charles, she thought of her mother, of the letters still kept carefully in their wooden box, of a love denied by debts and pride and secrets that had taken 2 decades to surface. She thought of every voice that had ever told her she was unworthy, every whispered judgment in every crowded room, and how thoroughly, finally, they had all been proven wrong. Charles took her hands as she reached him, his eyes bright with an emotion he made no effort to hide, and somewhere behind them, Florence was already dabbing at her eyes, while Jasper fumbled for a handkerchief to offer her. No regrets? Charles murmured, just for her. None, Catherine answered. Only gratitude that the truth found its way to us in time. What do you think became of Rowena in the years that followed? Do you believe Delia's regret was genuine, or merely the fear of losing what remained of her standing? And if you were in Catherine's place, could you have forgiven so completely, or would some part of that old wound have stayed open? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I will be reading every one of them. If this story moved you, give it a like. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale of love, loss, and the truths that refuse to stay buried.